affected your grades on the midterm. So I'm not going to change the rules, but I am going to stress, plead with you, all right? You can bring notes in. Do not copy things down verbatim, okay? Even if you remember to quote and say, oh, as Stan Allen said, blah, blah, blah. I don't care what Stan Allen said. Like, I can read what Stan Allen said. I want to know what you think. I want to hear it in your own words, all right? And I do not want to quote you in this class. But if you guys are simply quoting somebody else, it's not going to be good, all right? So please, just write it in your own words. I don't care if your English isn't perfect. That's all. That's like my minimum that I'm asking. Because otherwise, I can't tell if you've learned anything or whether you're just transcribing. All right? So you're allowed to bring in notes. I'm just requesting fervently that you not copy verbatim from any of the material. Okay? Are there any questions about that? So, okay, so that's the final exam. The other thing is the reading response journal, which in response to popular request is now due on Friday.
Instead of today.
It's
Yes.
it's due on Friday by the time that the office closes. I think they may not close exactly at 5. I think they may close 15 minutes earlier. So make sure that you bring your reading response journal. I'll set up a box with Calvin, and you can turn it in there. Really, all this need be, if you've been kind of keeping up with your work and doing it well, is just a kind of printing out your reading responses. But again, the reading responses also need to be in your own words. Right? That's the key. They're your response to the reading. Okay? It doesn't mean that sometimes you can't include a little quote here or there, but basically the reading response needs to be in your own words. Any questions about the reading responses or turning in or anything like that? So your final reviews are today? No, tomorrow. Tomorrow. Okay. Well, we may get through this today, and then you guys can go. All right. So, the point of this review, I see like what my job is to kind of go through the topics that we looked at during the second half of the semester. So I'm giving a kind of condensed version of the lectures, trying to, in a sense, extract of the argument of each one. But for you guys, this is your moment to ask questions, clarifications, whatever else that might be. So please raise your hand if you have any question at any point. Another thing that I want to, I know I've said this before, I will say this again. Even though you are allowed to bring in notes and pieces of paper, what I really, really recommend for studying for this exam is that you try to distill each of the readings down into 3 to 5 main points. Okay? So, and a good way of doing this is to use the very kind of old school flashcard method. So on the front, you would say, for Chicken Savi, function of ornament. On the back, you have 3 to 5 sentences that are basically saying like what the main points are of our argument. Okay? By doing that yourself, all right, I know sometimes you guys have study groups. If you do it yourself, that work of distilling imprints it in your brain, okay? It means when you're here under the time pressure, you can recall it much more easily than if it's in this kind of diffuse form in a big stack of notes. So I highly recommend it. That's kind of the work that you do to absorb the material and then to be able to get it out efficiently in response to questions. Okay, any other questions about the journal format or anything like that? So I just want to go through, this is what we have done, looked at over the course of semester. So we've had 12 topics, which were kind of not weighted exactly evenly. 7 before the midterm, and then just 5 since the midterm. So ornament, megacity, wasteland, ecology, and climate. So those are the 5 topics that we will be looking at this during today's class. And so here, I've shown this to you before, but I just generally want to kind of generate a kind of feeling for the nature of the shift that we've been looking at over the course of the semester. So we started out looking at some issues that were kind of appearing in the 1950s and the very beginning of the 1990s. We kind of progressed more or less chronologically. So essentially kind of deconstruction, 1980s, and then the full diagram, network, and landscape were essentially themes of the 1990s. Theory after theory, we then looked at this kind of critical turning point right around the turn of the 21st century, when there was a kind of profound challenge to the critical project as a whole. Essentially, to the notion of critical theory as championed, shall we say, by Peter Eisenman and Michael Hayes. And then the emergence, after that kind of moment of rupture, of new critical discourses which privileged different modes of organizing information or thinking through problems. So if we can, and so these are some of the, so we can talk about the emergence of the city as really a kind of central topic of theoretical investigation, as kind of, from moving really from the building as the object of architecture to this much more expanded field that is city and landscape, right, all in one. And then a number of issues that also come in parallel with a kind of crisis in faith in capitalism, in a kind of very aging notion of progress, and a looming sense of the kind of ecological crisis that is facing us today. So that's in a way to kind of paint the shift. And so if we look at these terms, with the ones on the left really associated with what we can say, what we can call kind of the critical project or critical theory, and then the ones on the right with the various theoretical tendencies that came in the wake of that crisis. So to move, we kind of move from the critical to the projective, from the index to the diagram, from object to field, from language to data, from disjunction to flow, from representation to questions of virtual, fragments to systems. So you can see that there is, if we kind of just look at these terms just as words, that there is a sense of disjunction and conflict and kind of fragmentation and separation that characterizes these words over on the left. And this kind of sense of connectivity, right, or network or system that really kind of unites very broadly the terms over here on the right. And so I think that that's one way, a useful way of thinking in general about the kind of progress or tendency of theory over the last 2 decades. Okay, so we're going to start with ornament. And ornament is a topic that we looked at, and through number one, the kind of works of Herzog and de Meuron as an architectural practice that has been very much engaged with the and then also through the publication of Archie Musavi, The Function of Ornament, which was a compendium of ornamented buildings and really was part of a kind of broader signal that ornament had shed its taboo status and had claimed a place really at the center of architectural concerns and architectural practice. So in the article that I wrote, I was identifying these 4 characteristics of contemporary ornament, which in the lecture we then examined with reference to the works of Gonzaga de Meuron. And these 4 kind of unifying characteristics are: 1, that ornament is integrated with the building surface. Number 2, it has an all-over pattern. Number 3 is a certain resistance to interpretation. And number 4 is a link to theories of affect, such as those articulated by Deleuze and Brockler. So if we were then to examine these 4 characteristics with reference to some particular buildings, so the first integrated with the building surface, and here we looked first at the Kloppenholz Sports Center by Gonzaga de Meuron, right from the very beginning of the 1990s, and the way in which they kind of fabricated this concrete by making using the chemicals to make it set at different times, which then generates this pattern. So that there's no kind of idea of an ornament that is somehow kind of applied to a surface, right? It's not a kind of sculptural excrescence, but is rather part and parcel of the surface itself. Here is a close-up of the concrete. So that there's, in a way, in this way, actively responding to Adolf Gross's ornament that is high is something that is piled up high, excrescence on the outside of the building. So a second characteristic of contemporary ornament is that there is an all-over pattern. So if you think about a lot of more historical ornament, ornament tended to be concentrated at particular kind of zones of the building. So for example, ornament would occur at the corners to demonstrate the kind of greater structural load that a masonry building would be concentrated in the corners. Or it would cluster around openings, such as windows and doors. Or it would be kind of under the roof as the pediment. So that ornament was, in a way, calling out particular structural elements of the building itself. When we look at contemporary ornament, we see that instead of this idea of ornament clustering around particular zones, it is instead evenly distributed over the surface of the building, so that there is a kind of different relationship in which the ornament is simply part of a kind of surface condition, rather than talking about structure in any way. And so here we looked at the Ricola production storage building, and in particular at the kind of 2, shall we say, ornamental treatments. So one being these the photographs of the leaves taken by the image taken from the photographer Karl Blossfeldt, turn of the 20th century photographer, and then also the way in which this concrete side of the building was intentionally allowed to darken in this almost barcode-like pattern from the rainwater which would fall into the roof and then trickle down the side of the building. So that you have this here, an ornament that is kind of created by a natural process itself, allowed to happen through a natural process. So number 3 is a resistance to interpretation. So if we look historically at one of the functions of ornament was historically was to communicate some ideas about the building to an audience. So whether that would be the kind of status and profession of the owner, or in the case of a private building, in the case of a public building, whether the building is a library or a museum or a church or a palace or whatever else, that was part of ornament's traditional role. Here instead, we have in contemporary ornament a resistance to interpretation. So ornament is no longer a vehicle through which the building then speaks to the audience. And we can see this already in the Ricola production and storage building, where even though a representational image is used, right, you can look at the facade and see clearly that this is a leaf, although we may not be able to recognize the leaf, we can see that it's a leaf. This leaf has no representational value. So maybe you might think that, well, this is Ricola, right? What is Ricola famous for? It's cough drops that use like all these, rare herbs from the tops of this piece. This leaf is not an herb. It's actually from a member of the asters of the Bates family. Anyway, the leaf is not actually telling us anything about Ricola. It is simply a leaf that is there. Now, this idea that might be a kind of hypothesis when we look at Ricola becomes explicit when we look at the Eberswalder Library, in which a series of unquestionably representational images have been chosen to decorate the exterior of this technical university library. And so here the images are drawn from a range of sources. Some are historical paintings, some are newspaper clippings, some are images of the natural world, some are images of mythological beings. But if any attempt is made to try to understand, well, why were these particular images chosen? Why are they put in the order they're put? Is this supposed to tell me something about Eberswalde or a library or a study of technical knowledge? Any of those questions simply runs into a brick wall, because the point of these images is absolutely not to communicate any kind of message. They are not open to a kind of iconographic or symbolic interpretation. That's not what they're doing. They are simply images. So in addition to the fact that their selection has no meaning, the fact that the images then repeat, right, over the different panels of the building, then you think about, imagine the building as though it were speaking. It would be like all of these voices saying the same word over and over and over and over again, kind of like a Philip Glass opera, right? So what you get is like instead kind of cacophony or noise, in which all of these potentially cancel each other out. So there's no kind of message here being transmitted by the images themselves. So this is what I would call a resistance to interpretation, right? Unlike postmodern ornament, which is trying to say something, right? If you think of Victorian Scott Brown, this is not trying to say anything at all. This idea is probably made even more visually explicit if we look at the Clubhouse Library and the Brandenburg University of Technology, which is covered actually with letters, right? But as you can see, the letters are layered and going over each other, so the total effect is that of this kind of mass of words that do not resolve into anything that is legible. So there's a kind of literal illegibility, which you can see in this. So those are kind of three three of these characteristics. The fourth has to do with theories of affect, and as I said, which derive from the work of philosophy of general. And here, if we look at the Lavand Center in Berkeley, Bedford, we can see all of those characteristics actually coming in the same place, right? So that we have an ornament that is integrated with the building surface. We have an ornament that has this kind of, it's not concentrated in any particular way around openings or corners or anything like this. It has this kind of all over effect. There is a resistance to interpretation, so we have a kind of repeating color scheme, but the colors do not correspond to any particular function, so it's not like, oh, green means exit door and blue means cafeteria or public space, or there's no, you can't ascribe any meaning to any of the colors. And then the fourth that we see here is this series of affect, by which what we understand is that the building itself is managing to interact with its viewers through, not through language, right, as we saw, we were talking about before, but through sensation. And so we can think through this by thinking about, first of all, the nature of color itself, which color is something that is difficult to interpret, highly subjective, has no intrinsic meaning to it, right? It's kind of a visual effect. And then also that the building itself has this kind of almost interactive relationship with its viewers. So it's not simply an object that's being held, but it seems to change also as the viewer moves around it. So that the way in which these colors kind of blur and fade and become more intense when you're standing right in front of them, and then less intense as you're kind of moving away, gives an impression that the building is responding to the viewer. Just as you, the viewer, are receiving sensations of the building itself is also changing in response to you. So this kind of notion of an interactivity on the level of sensations is something that is characteristic of these theories of affect, as described by Deleuze. Yes?
Okay, so I understand that it's affectations, but what is strategy for,
I would say affective rather than affectations.
it's, the color's supposed to use a reactive?
The color is not necessarily supposed to, I mean, it doesn't necessarily make you feel anything, but it's giving you a sensation, right? So color is a sensation, right? Color is not a property inherent in an object. Color comes from us seeing something and perceiving it, right? It's something that exists in our sensory system rather than the object. So it's one of those qualities that is dependent on sensation.
What is the strategy to achieve this wow factor?
So when you say the wow factor, sorry, what exactly?
Why are they putting this building and not making the architecture interesting? The form is pretty primitive and rectilinear.
Well, this actually is pretty exciting when you compare it to their other buildings. Like, I mean, you know, for a long period in their earlier part of their work, they're basically doing dumb boxes with a fancy skin, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of their shtick.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what they've always been doing. Is it's not about the form; it's about the skin or the surface. So,
So why do you have to know why are they doing that? They can make cool Frank Gehry shapes and achieve the same thing.
the same. I don't know the same. I mean, I think basically by I think Herzog is a better example here, but by making the architecture so simple, primitive, as you say, right? It's like, okay, it's a box. Like, I don't need to think about it. They're saying, no, we want you to think about what's happening with this and what's happening with the fact that we're ornamenting this, right? That's their polemical. That's their kind of polemical terrain, is in this use of ornament. It's not about the shape. Gehry does shape. That's fine. That's his shtick, right? I mean, but that's not what they're doing at this point. Yeah. I have a question. I don't know if you're you're thinking like sensational. Yes. Okay. All right. Right. So I'll do two things. I'm going to be more precise about what I mean by sensation, and then I'm going to say why I think experience is slightly different. Okay. So so there is like something that is sensational or sensationalism, right? Which is like a wow, but that is coming from this notion of sensation, which is simply about the senses, right? So sensation is anything that is taken in by one of the five senses. So through the sight, through the touch, through the hearing, through the smell, through the taste. That's essentially what we're talking about, and it's limited to that. Yeah. So it's something that is then very much in the present, right? So you are seeing, like I'm seeing you right now, or I'm smelling smell right now. I can have a memory of those things, but that's a memory, it's not happening in the here and now, right? So the sensation is all about a particular, something happening within the body in response to a stimulus at a particular moment, right? Now experience has to do with time, yeah? And with, maybe you can say that all the sensations that we've had over our life, that is our experience, or our experience over a couple of days, or whatever that is. But that is already a kind of much bigger thing temporally, and also then involves things like reflection and judgment and memory, and it's a lot more complicated. So sensation is like super pure body object, what's happening here. Okay? Was there, and no? Thank you, I'm sure that was helpful for other people as well. Okay. So lava I'm casting as this building that is encapsulating all of these four different characteristics of the. So then we get to Farshid Musavi and her book, The Function of Ornament, published in 2008, in which she is trying to claim a new role. So it's clear that in a multicultural and increasingly cosmopolitan society, symbolic communication is harder to enact, as it is difficult to gain a consensus on symbols or icons. Representational tools are less coded and unable to produce a convergence of culture. So essentially here she's saying that we no longer rely on the idea that symbolic meaning could be decoded by large, various, and global items. So this notion that ornament is supposed to communicate is in trouble once we deal with a global community and a lot of different cultures. Architecture needs mechanisms that allow it to become connected to culture, and it achieves this by continually capturing the forces that shape society as material to work with. Many buildings of the 20th century continue to effectively relate to culture by creating sensations and atmos. They build expressions out of an internal order that overcomes the need to communicate through a common language, the terms of which may no longer be available. Operating through direct sensations, they bypass the need for the codification of language and are able to shift across space and time. Their primary purpose is to render the invisible forces in contemporary culture visible. So essentially what Musavi is doing in this introduction, this argument, is saying that the whole book is, without saying it really explicitly, is a kind of argument against postmodernism's original rehabilitation of ornament, right? So we have modernism that says ornament is a crime. Postmodernism starts to reintroduce things like classical columns and pediments and all of this kind of stuff, so ornament makes a comeback. Musavi is saying it's time for ornament again, but what postmodernism did is was beholden to a bankrupt ideology, because they were expecting that people would understand what these classical columns meant. Because we're dealing now with a culture that is global and not simply a Western culture, we need to find a new role for ornament, which is going to rely on a different kind of language. And she then seizes upon this notion of a language language of the senses or language of affect. Okay, so that even though all of us may have grown up speaking different languages, and so we have different kinds of cultural structures through which we interpret things, we all have the same five senses. And the theory here is that our senses are all essentially comparable. And so in order to create a kind of universal language of ornament, we need an ornament that is connected directly to our senses and bypassing all of these kind of language and culture and all of these other things. Yeah.
So she's saying since there's some different cultures, they have their own ornament, like she pointed out, West African has all these geometric forms, and then we, West African, follow. The two are not going to see the same thing the same way.
Yeah, exactly. That somebody, that somebody from New Zealand or from Iceland or from Niger, they all see, you show everyone a hexagon, right? And everyone's going to say, oh, a hexagon means this.
Yeah.
And so we have to, in particular, she's talking about the classical tradition and saying ornament cannot consist of columns and pediments and acroteria and things like that because we now live in a globalized culture and this is going to be meaningless to everyone. That's her argument.
So like the acid concrete of the sports center is a good type of ornamentation? Because it's not, it's just pattern.
Because it's just pattern. Yeah, I think, I'm trying to remember if that building is in her book. She has a lot of other Herzog and de Meuron. Certainly she has lava. I can't remember if she has that one in her book. But yes, this is good because it's not trying to communicate in one particular language. It's relying on a language of sensation, which is theoretically universal.
You're saying anyone can come see that building and say, wow, that's cool, look at that concrete. Because it's different than other concrete.
That you would just be reacting visually to a pattern
Right.
and not trying to interpret it, not trying to get anything, trying to just be about this kind of visual sensation. And that's what contemporary ornament does. It just kind of engages with you in this, on this kind of physical basis.
Okay, so Herzog de Meuron essentially did that. They didn't use traditional ornamentation.
Yes,
They made contemporary ornamentation.
yes. They're not like, Venturi is using columns and things like that. They're not,
Upside down, broken.
all of that.
Okay.
So it's not using that kind of, it's doing this, which is not tied to a specific set of cultural.
And does this appear after Herzog de Meuron? Or, like now?
Yeah, there's a whole, I think there's a whole kind of range of buildings. There's a whole range of buildings that are doing like some combination of this, right? Not everyone does every combination. I think Herzog and de Meuron is a kind of good way of making this argument because you can see a kind of progression in their own buildings culminating in Lava, which I think does all four. So that was why I was looking at Herzog and de Meuron, right? I have some questions about Rosati's argument. I'm setting out this argument. I don't agree with her argument entirely. And that is because I think that she has a kind of utopian notion of sensation. I think that it's very difficult to totally separate sensation from our whole kind of framework that we have in our heads, right? That it's a kind of fiction, that there is some pure sensation which is divorced from cultural context. So each of us is an individual, and we do bring our own baggage with us, and we will bring it to the buildings that we see. So here, the example was the DM Museum, which, although it seems to, in many ways, encapsulate all of these characteristics of contemporary ornament, it seems to be operating with this notion of affect. It, in fact, has these characteristics which are highly symbolic of the particular context in which that building exists, being a kind of Northern California landscape context. So from the surface, which is this version of a pixelated screen of trees, which is then going to oxidize and turn into green, and is very much evocative of a eucalyptus grove.
Site-specific.
Which is site-specific, exactly, because eucalyptus grove is always what was on the site. To the way in which these courtyards are created to kind of mimic canyons. This whole courtyard is very much meant to be a kind of California landscape. There's an Andy Goldsworthy kind of crack, which is meant to be a fault line, to the way that these kind of building edges then kind of get silhouetted against the sky, which performs very much in the same way that we have these kind of outlines of hills here in California as the sun setting. So the whole building is evocative of a very specific California landscape in a lot of ways. And so although all kinds of people can have sensations, the sensations are not actually without a specific meaning. So I think that Musavi's argument is ultimately a problematic one because it relies on this fiction that somehow we can separate sensation and think about. Okay, that went on a little bit too long. Anyways, are there questions about ornaments? You need to speak up a little. I heard you, but it's hard. So, is there any difference between
symbolic nature of ornaments and its requirement of the symbolism that derives from a specific area that you would need to visit anyway or not need to visit, but you would be there, would be in anyway, in the buildings of the building. So for this building, the position of part
So I think if I'm understanding your question, you're saying, is there any significant difference between the use of something like the classical orders, which has a specific history, and then the references to a specific landscape?
Well, I just, not that we didn't see there being a difference, because you're saying that you think Musavi's argument is ultimately a little far in that way. Is there ultimately a difference between, should we differentiate between something symbolic that is of the landscape that the building is in, and something that is evocative of classical orders that you wouldn't need that much.
Right. I think there is a difference. That's not my argument with Musavi, right? So I think there is a difference in that we can't assume that we all have knowledge of the classical tradition anymore. It's simply not part of our educational system in the way that it was 60 generations ago. So that kind of assumption is, I think, bankrupt. At the same time, for me, Musavi's argument that all buildings need to do is to kind of generate sensation and have this kind of sensation, relationship to senses, and ignoring the fact that the other ideas are also necessarily part of the picture. Okay, so I think there is an important difference, but I think she is she's trying to create a kind of pure realm of the senses that I don't think actually exists. Okay? It's actually a rehash of an argument that already happened in the 18th century about the role of the senses. Anyway, that's a longer
Has
story.
been repeated.
She's repeating stuff that, this is like from the 18th century. Anyway, that's a longer, that's a much longer thing. No, but it is. It's like, you can like argue against Musavi with like very old arguments. Okay, so any other questions?
Sorry, that was very
他有疑问问题我都不听。
No, it's good. I can talk about one all day. Okay, so megacities. So for megacities, we did two things. We read two pieces. So the Arjuna Pallai, Modernity at Large, the chapter from that, Disjuncture and Difference in the Global Cultural Economy, and then Matthew Gandy's kind of critical take on the whole Lagos project, the whole Harvard Lagos project. Matthew Gandy coming to this from the perspective of a geographer who is kind of much more engaged with the entire political situation in Lagos. But here, so I want to focus a bit on Madurai and this very influential article in which he talks essentially about the phenomenon of globalization and specifically analyzes it through these 5, what he calls, scapes. And the suffix of scapes is meant to be evocative of landscapes. So he's kind of using this landscape analogy. And he's using it, number one, to, let's say, suggest a kind of shared set of experiences and values, but also to suggest a kind of particular perspective on these phenomena from various places. And this is misusing the word scapes, which actually has nothing to do with perspectives, but might be with him. Okay, so the five different scapes are, number one, ethnoscapes, which are basically the landscape of persons who constitute the shifting world in which we live, so tourists, immigrants, refugees, exiles, guest workers, and other moving groups and individuals that constitute an essential feature of the world and appear to affect the politics of and between nations to a hitherto unprecedented degree. Number two, technoscape, the global configuration, also ever fluid, of technology, and the fact that technology, both high and low, both mechanical and informational, now moves at high speeds across various kinds of previously impervious boundaries. Financscape, the disposition of global capital is now a more mysterious, rapid, and difficult landscape to follow than ever before, as currency markets, national stock exchanges, and commodity speculations move mega monies through national turnstiles at blinding speed. Okay, so, and these three for him are related. I'm going to go through reading the other two and then I'll talk about these. Mediascape refers both to the distribution of the electronic capacities to produce and disseminate information, so newspapers, magazines, television stations, and film production studios, and to the images of the world created by these media. They provide large and complex repertoires of images, narratives, and ethnoscapes to viewers throughout the world, in which the world of commodities and the world of news and politics are profoundly mixed. Sorry, I was obviously typing this with it too small, so that's why I'm all the typing. The lines between the realistic and the fictional landscapes and many audiences see are blurred, so that the farther away these audiences are from the direct experiences of metropolitan life, the more likely they are to construct imagined worlds that are chimerical, aesthetic, even fantastic objects, particularly if assessed by the criteria of some other perspective, some other imagined world. And last, ideoscapes are also concatenations of images, but they are often directly political. These ideoscapes are composed of elements of the Enlightenment worldview, which consists of a chain of ideas, terms, and images, including freedom, welfare, rights, sovereignty, representation, and the master term, democracy. So, so these five, essentially what he does is he groups them in a way two kind of families. So the first being the ethnoscape, the technoscape, and the financscape, which are then kind of integrated with one another, and the last two being mediascape and ideoscape, so the worlds of images and ideas, which themselves are also kind of very much involved with are these kind of 5 categories through which Akadurai seeks to analyze a kind of global, a world situation which has been transformed by globalization, right? So globalization is something that exists certainly in the economic realm, but he's saying it also has this way of infiltrating not just kind of money and people, the movement of people, but the way we see things and the way we think about things, right? So the way that kind of images make pictures of reality, which we then incorporate, and then how this affects the way that we think about things in our minds, right? So there's this kind of reality out there and a reality in here, which are all being shaped by so these, and really for Akadurai, who is basing a lot of this on the work of Benedict Anderson with these notions of imagined communities, has to do really with the centrality of ideas of things in how important ideas and images of things are to the way we make sense of our realities, right? So that it's not simply about power relations or capital, but very much about also the centrality of how we perceive and how we think. And so here, what I suggest to you as a kind of exercise as you're studying for this portion of the exam would be to take these 5 terms, right, to kind of write, I'm here quoting Akadurai, but to kind of write in your own words how you understand each of these, right, what kinds of phenomena it incorporates. And then to think about how are these concepts present in the movie about Legos, okay? So if we think about the whole project on Legos with REM, and you can also then use Matthew Gandy's piece to kind of remind yourself of the salient aspects of it, or if you want to watch it again, it's also available in the library and DVD. But to think through, in a sense, how is the city of Lagos being represented by this film, by Full House, and by Full House as a representative of the GSD project on the city, right? So the GSD has decided that dealing with cities kind of all over the globe is part of its kind of purview, and is then representing Lagos and other cities, in particular ways, focusing on particular kinds of things. And so the kind of work of interpretation would be exactly to say, okay, how can we see ethnoscapes, right, in Lagos? How can we see ethnoscapes? How can we see financescapes? How can we see mediascapes? How can we see ideoscapes? What are examples of these kinds of scapes within the film that Ren creates? So that essentially would be how I would suggest that we do work this kind of topic. And so we talked a little bit about, in class, we talked a little bit about how representations of cities have changed over time. If we think about medieval visions of cities in which the wall becomes really important, to 18th and 19th century vision of cities in which you have either the square or the monument, right, which is the kind of city becomes a collection of public and private, or the city becomes a collection of monuments, which are then isolated, within the urban fabric. How instead is Lagos being represented? Are there boundaries? What is the connection like? What are the kinds of things that are talked about, right? And so we discuss these notions of networks and system, right? So like how does the representation of a city change when what you're interested in is are questions of connectivity, of network, of there are all those kind of notions of value and commodity and how those are defined and how those
How
are.
everyone goes to church and donates to the church except
Right, what is the church, what is that church giving where they're giving them the money, right? I mean, giving them ideas, right? Like, oh, I mean, this is essentially, right, so like what it's, you know, nothing tangible, right? Nothing tangible at all. But, so exactly, so if you, you know, remember the kind of various things of the movie is and try to fit them within this rubric so that you can, talk through, the project, in this way. And this was a question of what does, what, you know, Graham, who is always good with the kind of witty aphorism, but, you know, he sees also the way that Graham's whole attitude towards Lagos changes. So if we think of like learning from Lagos, what does Graham learn from Lagos, right? He comes in with a certain perspective, he goes out with another perspective. Neither of them is, you know, they're both perspectives of outsiders, right? Even though that has, it's changed, it's not like it's suddenly being insider knowledge, but also kind of being able to characterize the way that Graham's attitude then changes over the course of okay, any questions about this? Okay, so, wasteland. So here, we had two readings. One by, Ignacio de Soler Morales, and the other by Juan Pico. Both about, particular kinds of landscapes that, Soler Morales calls Taramba, and, Pico calls anxious landscapes. So standard using the French and the French English. And so Soler Morales talking about these, first to kind of characterize these empty, abandoned spaces in which a series of occurrences have taken place, seem to subjugate the eye of the urban photographer. Such urban space, which I will denote by the French expression, assumes the status of fascination, the most solvent sign with which to indicate what cities are and what our experience of them is. So he's doing a number of things. Number one is he is kind of defining a particular kind of place, space, the Taramba. He then is linking it to a question of representation, specifically that of photography and specifically that of urban photography, right? So it's like, just as Horner says, landscape and image are inseparable, Soler Morales is also saying that here wasteland and photography are inseparable. And then the significance of this relationship between landscape and image is that it helps to reveal what cities are, so what a kind of modern metropolitan condition is, and what our experience of them is. So not just what they are in themselves, but also what our understanding and experience is, right? So these are the kind of, let's say, set of things that are involved in this notion of this. And so then he goes on to be a little bit more specific about what kinds of spaces. So these strange places exist outside of the city's effective circuits and productive structures. From the economic point of view, industrial areas, railway stations, ports, unsafe residential neighborhoods, and contaminated places are where the city is no longer. Unincorporated margins, interior islands void of activity, oversights, these areas are simply uninhabited, unsafe, and unproductive. In short, they are foreign to the urban system, mentally exterior to the physical interior of the city, its negative image as much a critique as a possible alternative. So, some of the characteristics of the Taramba are, number one, a kind of uselessness, right? So they're outside of the city's productive structures. We could say that they are marginal, right, in many ways. So they are marginal economically, they're marginal spatially, and marginal also conceptually, right, in that being foreign to the urban system, mentally exterior to the city, a negative image. But then in the end, this as much a critique as a possible alternative. So standing as a critique in that they are kind of outside of the system and unincorporated by that system, on the margins of it, unproductive, but then also harboring this sense of possibility, right, of future possibility. So that's where I think also part of this fascination of this notion of wasteland resides, in that it is, at the same time that it is a kind of marginal space, it is also seems to offer a space for utopian experimentation, right? So the very fact that it is useless, it doesn't have designated use or productivity or any of these things, means that there's this opening of a space for experimentation and alternatives outside of the norm. So then Sola Morales turns to the role of the architect. In this situation, the role of the architect is inevitably problematic. Architecture acts as an instrument of organization, of rationalization, and of productive efficiency, capable of transforming the uncivilized into the cultivated, the fallow into the productive, the void into the built, right? So he's saying that the essential drive of architecture is exactly that of making something out of what seems to be nothing, right? Transforming the uncivilized into the cultivated, the fallow into the productive, the void into the built. And so, and he asks, how can architecture act in the Terranbag without becoming an aggressive instrument of power and abstract reason, right? So, if design is going to be engaged in these sorts of spaces, which it inevitably and increasingly will be, because more and more of these spaces will exist, right? That our design is not going to be called upon to be operating in a kind of blank slate, right? But it will often be in places that were formerly used for something else, and now the use has changed. And so the question is, given that these spaces have kind of fragile qualities of their own, how does architecture operate within this kind of complicated situation? So if that is Sola Morales, Antoine Picot instead, Anxious Landscapes from the Ruin to Rust, looks at, let's say, the position of the kind of derelict object within over a span of history. So moving from the role of the ruin in more historical paintings and landscapes to then the kind of rusted, derelict object in more contemporary objects, in more contemporary situations. How can we understand this shift? So how is it that, he writes, turning our back on several centuries of tradition, we generally associated the contemplation of landscape with the idea of a certain peace of mind. We are so often disconcerted, even anxiety-ridden, by landscapes of this type. I mean, we can disagree with this whole premise and say, really? Like, since when would the contemplating landscapes not fill people with some kind of anxiety? I mean, I think it's a bit of a romanticization of the past. But anyway, we could still say that the kind of reaction to these contemporary landscapes does have a difference, right? There is some kind of. In traditional landscapes, the productions of man, his constructions in particular, surrender themselves progressively to nature in the form of the ruin. The ruin reintegrated in successive stages the traces of human activity into the cycle of nature. Why does rust frighten us while the ruin is adored with a reassuring character? The ruin restored man to nature. Rust, on the other hand, confines him in the middle of his productions as if within a prison all the more terrible since he is its builder. The biggest fear suggested by the contemporary technological landscape is that of the death of humanity in the midst of the signs of its triumph over nature. So, yes, so anyway, so for Cole, there is this kind of significant difference between this contemporary position and that of the past, and it specifically has to do with the change of position of humanity itself, right? So he looks at this attitudes towards, kind of changing attitudes towards the derelict or the ruinous, and also then a changing index of the human relationship to nature. And so here in this lecture, we then kind of, so these are two more recent contemplations of the kind of derelict urban or industrial landscape. We then looked at kind of that, starting with Robert Smithson's 1967 article, Tour of the Monuments of Passaic, New Jersey, in which Smithson goes out to New Jersey and takes a kind of grand tour of this derelict industrial area, which, because it's a Saturday, happens not to be actually active. And we look at the way in which Smithson kind of recasts a landscape paradigm into kind of transforming it through processes of reproduction into a kind of almost grimy industrial scene, and how this kind of positioning of this landscape genre then causes him to see these various kind of objects of industry as a kind of contemporary post-industrial grand tour. So New Jersey kind of taking the place of Rome, and these various industrial monuments taking the place of the kind of Colosseum and March of Trajan, etc. So for Smithson's tour, and how this article became an early and very influential articulation of a kind of aesthetics of the post-industrial. So as Smithson is writing this in 1967, we have Bernd and Hilla Becker starting really in the 1970s, so they have this long career and many students. But starting in the 1970s, who are then taking photographs of factories and other kinds of industrial structures. So aestheticizing here the industrial, but again, not so much in a kind of heroic way, but in a way that seems then to also point to a kind of industrial era which has which is on the decline. So here, and this is the way they were traditionally, the photographs were often put into this kind of grid of monuments. And so the photographs, so the kind of Smithson's articulation of this post-industrial aesthetic, the Becker's photographs of these factories, clearly important to the decision to follow the design of Richard Hugg in Gasworks Park, and instead of removing this derelict factory and actually retaining it on the site as a kind of monument, a focal monument within the park. One of the very earliest examples of this type of park that is actually incorporating unused industrial structures as part of its aesthetic design. After this, another key example being Pacer Labs and Partners Duisburg Nord. His transformation of the Tyson steel factory, which was responsible for a lot of the steel production for World War II, having been decommissioned and misused and essentially kind of overgrown with plants, then transformed into a park for recreational purposes. So part of this much larger transformation from labor to leisure, and within this transformation also we looked at the very strong kind of redemptive desires that often lie at the heart of these finally, the Fresh Kills, so the more contemporary project, the Fresh Kills landfill, which has been established by Robert Moses. We looked at it at Porter Clark, 1972 Fresh Kill movie, which essentially shows the intentional construction of the truck, and which essentially is kind of framing art as process, right, which is also largely out of the hands of the artist himself, and then focusing on the role of Fresh Kill as this largest landfill. And then the closing of the landfill, and then from 2003 on, it's the beginnings of its transformation by James Horner and field operations into a major park in Staten Island. And so this kind of began its transformation from dump, right, absolute epitome of this notion of waste, an area that's defined by its waste, into then a space for recreation and wholesome activities like organic farmers markets and bird watching and all these kind of middle class activities which are now sanctioned. But just then kind of leaving with the, I think, Zola Morales' very astute question of how can architecture act in the town of I without becoming an aggressive instrument of power and abstract reason. In the case of Fresh Kills, we might say, well, there was nothing much worth saving in the landfill, but in something else, for example, like the High Line, there are qualities that become lost once design kind of takes too much of a
But this is an answer. Fresh Kills is the way architecture can act without being power and abstract reason.
Okay, all right.
This is how you do it.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad that they convinced you.
I don't know why he had any doubt that architecture cannot act like solve everything, you know?
It's not, I think it's solved. I think that the issue is like, you know, what are the limits, right, of design? Like, does design need to design, right? So there's a question of how much do you do? So Porter is exactly about saying, well, we're just setting up processes, right, which are then going to evolve on their own,
Sure.
right? So that's,
In a system that can incorporate all the possibilities, but that's how you do it. Parking on the way.
That's
It
the
was a
idea.
meat factory, he put in the food qualities, and now the thing is with online.
I mean, the shoe meat, I think, had a kind of different motivating idea, right? Than the same, the OMA project for that site, which was exactly the kind of setting up of things. I think what Shumi actually ended up doing was a bit different. Yeah. I think all of these things are essentially, they are, the question that they bring up is about the role and the agency of the designers, right?
Essential. That's the role, essential.
Is essential.
Essential.
So, okay, any other questions? All right, so ecology, right. Okay. So, ecology, the lecture on ecology, we started out looking at, remembering the whole landscape tradition and the way in which the painterly conventions of a few 17th century artists had a very significant effect on the way that the 19th century America understood its landscapes, both those kind of found as here in the West, or designed, as in Central Park with Frederick Law Olmsted. And so essentially this how kind of paintings then conditioned the way that Western landscapes were seen. We then started to establish a dichotomy, or at least a distinction between a kind of landscape paradigm on the one hand and an ecological paradigm term as kind of took some starting point as it's the coining of the term by Ernst Haeckel in 1866, which, if you remember, comes from this bringing together of the Greek poemas, house, dwelling, place of habitation, with logia, the study of. And just once again, I want to stress the kind of the peculiarity in a way, but I think significant peculiarity of using this word house as part of this term, which is meant to refer to the scientific study of the relationships living organisms have with each other and with their environment, right? That we use this term house or dwelling place, which implies a kind of aspect of caretaking, right? Which is important. So ecology, the kind of questions that are addressed include life processes and adaptations, distribution and abundance of organisms, movement of materials and energy through living communities, successional development of ecosystems, abundance and distribution of biodiversity in the context of the environment. So we tried to then say, well, what are the kind of similar ideas that run through these various definitions? And so change being one significant thing, right? So if we look at like processes, adaptations, movement, development, right? These are all words that have to do with change. So ecology as a field of study is something that is very much interested in change or development over time. We then looked at a few key figures in the development of ecology as a particular approach to the environment. So first, Stephen Forbes, whose article on the microcosm of a lake was one of the very early texts in ecology, in which he outlined this concept of a community of interest, which is also a Greek web, which he described in these terms. Two ideas are thus seen to be sufficient to explain the order evolved from the seeming chaos that defines this lake. The first, that of a general community of interest among all classes of organic beings, and the second, that of the beneficent power of natural selection, which compels such adjustments of the rates of destruction and the multiplication of the various species as shall best promote this common interest, right? So that basically, nature is like, this kind of scene of, it's like every beast or every species for itself, right? A kind of mass, like, one animal eating another, everyone trying to reproduce, and everyone like kind of killing each other. But that actually within this scene of kind of craziness and chaos and carnage, there is actually a kind of balancing principle, which is that of every species having a kind of particular size, which means that the entire community is functioning well. So this idea of a community of interest becomes then also fundamental to the notion that is developed by Alvin Leopold, particularly in his influential Sand County Almanac of 1949. Where, among other things, he writes, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." So we see, first of all, the kind of unit being identified as the biotic community rather than a single one species. And then there are these kind of overarching characteristics that guide the shape of this, being integrity, stability, and beauty. And then also an ethical dimension, which is then able to determine that something is either right or wrong. And then I talked about this a little bit with his essay, Thinking Like a Mountain, in which he was looking at the extermination of wolves in national land and how the unintended consequences of that was that the deer multiplied and overgrazed the mountain, which then led to a huge loss of diversity of other species. And so basically what he realized eventually as a result of this time was that the wolf, the predator, is an incredibly important member of this entire community because it keeps all of the other species in check and in balance with each other, and actually ends up leading to a greater variety and stability of the community as a whole. So that if one thinks from the perspective of the mountain rather than that of a specific species, then the outcome actually is a better. So it's a kind of restatement by other terms of this notion of the biotic community, of this idea of a common interest of species, right? So the mountain being the understanding of this common interest. So if these works were significant within the development of a perspective, which we can characterize as an ecological perspective, the place of Rachel Carson's Silent Springs is still extraordinarily important because she really brought an ecological perspective to a vast readership and kind of ends up sparking really a movement, a kind of popular movement. So her impact, was the greatest of any of these that we've looked at so far. And you'll remember that the kind of essence of the way in which her book is then expressing an ecological argument is here encapsulated in this quote: "We spray our elms, and the following springs are silent of robin song, not because we sprayed the robins directly, but because the poison traveled step by step through the now familiar elm leaf earthworm robin cycle." Right. So the importance of attending both to not just to intended consequences, but also to unintended consequences, and of thinking of the natural world as a system in which everything is connected to everything else, and the fallacy of imagining that, as Naomi Klein was also saying, that you can have a quote-unquote sacrifice zone over here in which you're doing whatever you need to for kind of extraction of resources, but then over here you can protect a kind of wilderness area, and that somehow you can separate one from the other, and that everything will be fine, right? No, instead, everything is linked together in a system, and so one thing is not separated from another. In terms of design consequences, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was kind of fundamental to the thinking of Ian McHarg and his very influential book, Design with Nature, which essentially developed the whole notion of city and regional planning as a discipline. So McHarg, who's trained both in landscape and in city planning, brings these together to think about the concept of a unit as an entire region with all of its various systems layered on each other. Right? So the systems being both those of the ecosystem, but also of the human community that lives in it. So here it's a notion of design by layers, which is developed and promoted by McHarg and through the department at Penn that he led for so many years. So from McHarg, we then started to look at the development of the environmental movement in the United States, and here the figure of Stuart Brand, who develops the Whole Earth Catalog beginning in 1968, which was essentially dependent on a systems thinking model and also helping to popularize this notion that we can't simply be thinking in terms of, like our house or our community or our city or our nation, that we are all inhabitants of spaceship Earth, and we need to develop a global perspective because the issues that we are facing are ones that are essentially global. And this, the kind of development of kind of systems thinking approach in the writings of Gregory Bateson in this work, Mythologies of Epistemology, in which he critiques the separating out of ideas or of communities of interest. So he says, let us now consider when you make the epistemological error of choosing the wrong unit, you end up with the species versus the other species around it, or versus the environment in which it operates, man against nature. You end up, in fact, with Kaneohe Bay polluted, or Lake Erie a slimy green mess, and let's build bigger atom bombs to kill off the next door neighbors. There is an ecology of bad ideas, just as there is an ecology of weeds, and it is characteristic of the system that basic error propagates itself. It branches out like a rooted parasite through the tissues of life, and everything gets into a rather peculiar mess. So here, this critique of thinking in this kind of, not about a global community of interest, but rather in this kind of very narrowly individualistic way of, well, I only care about me and my immediate surrounds, rather than realizing that we are all in this kind of same boat together, and that the environmental crisis is absolutely a global one. But here focusing not just on kind of action, but really of thoughts, right? Of a kind of, as you said, like an ecology of thought. And so focusing then on the mental aspects of the situation. So Bateson's ideas are very important for Guattari's development of an argument in The Three Ecologies, which was published in 2000s, in which he essentially also asserts that now more than ever, nature cannot be separated from culture. In order to comprehend the interactions between ecosystems, the mechanosphere, and the social and individual universes of reference, we must learn to think transversely. So essentially, we have these ecosophy, which is divided into these three registers: environmental ecology, social ecology, and mental ecology, which then are all between themselves interconnected. So environmental ecology being the relationships with our environment and the way that we handle it. Social ecology being relationships between peoples, and then mental ecology is then having to do with communities also of thought, right? So that this like the kind of significance of the let's say ideoscape, right? To use a term of Haderach's in ecology. And then we ended up by trying to distinguish, to bring this whole argument back into the design realm, between two different movements within design, which followed one upon another quite closely. So first, landscape urbanism, which we can associate with the 1990s, and also a period of time when Melissa Mustafadi was chairman of the Architectural Association. And then ecological urbanism, which succeeds landscape urbanism as a kind of landscape urbanism 2.0, we could say, when Mustafadi then goes to the PSD. So here, the principles of ecological urbanism as outlined by Mustafadi being that ecological urbanism unites architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism. It recognizes the scope and impact of ecology, is multi-scalar, it blurs boundaries between the real and the virtual, the urban and the rural, is committed to density as a strategy, has the potential to respond to and transform other criteria that affect the shape of cities, such as geography, orientation, weather, pollution, sound, and smell. It is not a series of fixed rules, but flexible principles that can be adapted to the circumstances and conditions of a particular location. It is directly concerned with the articulation of the interface between the urban and the political, and offers opportunities for greater social and spatial democracy. So these are the kind of aspirations of ecological urbanism's platform. And then we ended with essentially trying to distill the difference between the landscape urbanism approach and the ecological urbanism approach, And if we look simply at definitions of landscape and ecology, we start to then discern what the significant differences are. So with landscape, comprises the visible features of an area of land, including the physical landforms such as mountains, valleys, and water bodies, such as lakes, ponds, and seas, living elements of land cover such as vegetation, and human elements such as different forms of land use, building, infrastructure, as well as transitory elements such as lighting and weather conditions. Versus ecology, which is the scientific study of the relationships living organisms have with each other and with their natural environment. And if we look at this definition of landscape, essentially it's focusing, one, on visible aspects, right? So invisible things are not part of it. It also is focusing on objects on the surface or kind of immediately above, right? So it's not really talking about underground things. And it's really thinking about landscape as a kind of area with objects in it, right? That's kind of this definition of landscape that we've had way back from the 17th and 18th centuries. Ecology, instead, does not specify objects. It is simply talking about scientifically studying relationships, right? Between organisms and each other, and between organisms and their environment. So it's a study of relationships, which are inherently, usually, often invisible, right, or seen by other things. So it's a different kind of approach, one that we can then define or identify as being related to a systems theory perspective, right? So ecology is part of systems theory. Ecological urbanism is likewise a systems theory approach to urbanism. That's a kind of essential difference that we have here. Any questions about this? Okay, so finally, climate. And here, what I had you read for the class were two different works, which were published, one very close to one another, so Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, and Pope Francisco's Laudato Si, on the care of our common home, right? So again, that notion of ecology, right, the oikos being home or dwelling place. Francis is talking about Kazaku, common home. So with Naomi Klein, which we saw the movie in class, there is still time to avoid catastrophic warming, she writes in 2014. We're now in 2017, I don't know. But not within the rules of capitalism as they are currently constructed, which is surely the best argument there has ever been for changing those rules. Our economic system and our planetary system are now at war, right? So the question here essentially being, if Naomi Klein is characterizing this as capitalism versus the climate, right? How can you rephrase that argument in your own words? Why is it capitalism versus the climate? Why are our economic system and our planetary system at war with one another? Why are they incompatible systems? Okay, so that's the kind of question that I would ask you to think about as you're studying for this exam, right? What is the essence of that argument that you're making? Pope Francis, we have here an argument. We are not God. The earth was here before us, and it has been given to us. This allows us to respond to the charge that Judeo-Christian thinking, on the basis of the Genesis account, which grants man, quote-unquote, dominion over the earth, has encouraged the unbridled exploitation of nature by painting him as domineering and destructive by nature. This is not a correct interpretation of the Bible as understood by the Church. Although it is true that we Christians have at times incorrectly interpreted the Scriptures, nowadays we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies absolute domination over other creatures. keeping means caring, protecting, overseeing, and preserving. This implies a relationship of mutual responsibility between human beings and nature, right? So once again, this notion that we saw in ecology of the earth as a kind of dwelling place of which we are then the caretakers, right? Which doesn't mean that we can't touch anything, but it means a kind of caring, protecting, overseeing, and preserving attitude toward the earth is what he is in fact promoting. A politics which is concerned with immediate results, supported by consumerist sectors of the population, is driven to produce short-term growth. In response to electoral interests, governments are reluctant to upset the public with measures which could affect the level of consumption or create risks for foreign investment. The myopia of power politics delays the inclusion of a far-sighted environmental agenda within the overall agenda of governments. So here, in a sense, what I would want you to think about is you have two writers who are coming from, almost diametrically opposed perspectives, right? As I said before in class, in response to your question, Naomi Klein, kind of liberal, Marxist, Jewish family. Pope Francis. And both with messages which are about climate change, about our relation to the environment, about the way in which capitalism figures in our current relationship to the environment, and also about the way in which climate change, a criticism, right, of modernism's complicity with the capitalist system, right? That essentially the whole argument that modernism made, that architecture needs to be of its own time, right? Every generation will build its own house, and that historical structures need to be swept aside for an architecture that is absolutely about the present. The kind of thinking that I argued underlies essentially it's like the kind of IKEA mode of giving you good design, which is only supposed to last for a few years, so then you will buy it again, right? So the way in which design becomes complicit with a kind of culture of consumption and kind of rapid consumability. So this is an argument that Tafuri makes about modernism, right? So architecture, design, are by necessity involved in economic systems, right? And so if here we have arguments that the economic system that we are all currently living with is at war with a kind of planetary system, right? Then it's a very important question of how architecture positions itself within that relationship. It's going to be up to each of you to make that decisions for yourselves as you go out into the world as designers, right? Of where you are going to stand with relation to two systems that are at odds with one another, right? But it's something that I hope you all think about as you go off and have your successful careers. All right, are there any questions about climate or about anything else? I have a couple of announcements just to remind you that we went through at the beginning. Two things. Final exam is 2 weeks from today, 8 a.m. This through 1 hour earlier than we normally come. So please set your alarms. I've had too many people come like New Year's Eve because they slept at 8 a.m. Number 2, your reading response journals are due on Friday. By the time the office closes, we're going to leave at 4:45. So get those into by Friday.
我想着，但是他刚才说了2个小时，还是现在哦，到时候其实我觉得我们那个什么，我们专业课也应该 see you in 2 weeks。不应该有个设计周吗？感觉我们这回就直接把设计周跳过了。